Hi. Today we're going to continue with American history. Previously we reached virtually the end of the Civil War, 1865, a huge and important development. It's still, by the way, the war in which more Americans died than in any other war, as I suppose your own Civil War, let's call it, as we call it, the Korean War, killed more of you than any war that you've ever had. In any case, civil wars are terrible and terrible. After the Civil War, attitudes in the North, the winners, the victors, attitudes in the North varied. Some wanted to punish the South. Some were angry. After all, many Northerners died. Scandals like the discovery of the conditions of Southern prisons, prisons for captives, captured Northern soldiers. Andersonville in South Carolina, scandal, terrible. Starvation, just terrible. Many were angry then. Many in the North were angry. Others saw this as an opportunity to capitalize, exploit, take advantage of a new territory almost. After all, the South was ruined. Here was an opportunity to go down there, buy land cheaply, change things radically. The idealists, formerly the abolitionists, those who had wanted so badly to free the slaves, saw this as an opportunity to suddenly put black people in positions of power. This was a disaster. One reaction of this was the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK. You've heard of it. No one would sympathize very much with the Ku Klux Klan or with the Klan. That is, their methods were violent. They did some terrible things. But one can understand a little bit how this came about. The so-called carpetbaggers were Northerners who came down quickly to the South, carrying their carpet bags, their suitcases. And really, I think perhaps the real meaning was they planned to take back to the North a lot of money in the same carpet bags. Anyway, these were the people who were most hated, maybe. Also hated were the blacks who suddenly found themselves in power, in positions of power. Of course, they were put there by the whites, by the Northerners who came down. In any case, both of these groups of people were hated by the Southerners, and so it's not surprising to find them resorting to violence. Of course, they hated the fact that they had lost the war too. This fueled their indignation, their rage, and so some terrible things happened. In any case, this was the situation after the Civil War. The period is normally called Reconstruction. Reconstruction dates from 1865 to about, well, when does it end? Let's say 1880, but that's a somewhat arbitrary date because Reconstruction continued for a long time. Anyway, the period from 1865 to 1880 I think was the ugliest period of American history. This was the low point, I think. Scandal, a time kind of not so much decadence as just low behavior. Actually, the second half of the 19th century was a pretty ugly time for various reasons. It was a time of vast expansion to the west, acquisition of all the other territories that we needed to complete our continental United States. That is all the way to the west coast. The final territory, I think, was Oregon. We got it all. It wasn't pretty. And then all this territory meant that people wanted to populate these lands, to exploit these lands, to grab money quickly. The railroads had begun in about 1820, that is well earlier. But the railroads continued to be built until the Transcontinental Railroad reached a course all the way to the West Coast. This meant rapid expansion, lots of money. This was the age of, what is their name? I forget. The millionaires, the first millionaires really, the Fisks and the Goulds and the Carnegies and the, yes, Fords later. These people who made vast fortunes. At a time like this meant that companies, oil was another one, Rockefeller was another. These people made immense amounts of money, and as much as possible they created monopolies. They monopolized the industries that they controlled until the laws were changed to control, to limit their rapacity, rapacious, voracity, their snatching of huge fortunes. The second half of the 19th century was a time when these vast fortunes were to be made, but also a time of terrible poverty, urban poverty, because of course immigration continued, even increased. The millions from Ireland, leaving Ireland during the potato famines in Ireland, terrible. Millions of Irish then came to America. Of course, people like them normally settled in cities. Hence, Boston is heavily Irish. New York, a lot of Irish. Millions came. The Irish liked cities. They weren't farmers. The Germans, the Swedes, they went to the Midwest. They were farmers, where they still are. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa. A lot of German and Swedish or Scandinavian settlers there, farmers. The Irish went to the cities. The Italians went to the cities. In the cities, they found jobs working for very little money, and so the creation of slums and the emergence of slums, which had begun in the first half of the century, became a huge problem. But what was lying behind this was the emergence of a labor movement. And the labor movements are scary things because it's a clear case of the haves versus the have-nots. The haves wanting to keep what they have, the have-nots desperate enough to challenge the haves for, let's say, a piece of the pie. That's a metaphor we often use. In any case, the American labor movement was an ugly thing. It was ugly everywhere, but it was, I think, particularly ugly in America. As usual, the wealthy opposed the formation of labor unions. The wealthy used their influence to control the police. The police were particularly brutal to the labor unions. It wasn't pretty. But gradually, slowly, through the presidencies of people like Grover Cleveland, who was elected twice with an interval between. He's the only president of whom who had this strange fortune. Gradually, by the 1890s, we had a labor movement that was viable, that was surviving, that was protected by laws. And what we see here is, again, the polarity, two poles, opposite poles, the polarity of basically Republicans and Democrats. The Democratic Party became the party of labor, the little man, the common man, the immigrant, the blacks, the small farmer. The Republicans, the party of business, the wealthy businessmen, business owners, and small business owners too, mostly Republicans. Those who still admire the Democratic Party because of that tradition. A little bit heroic, a little bit admirable. Of course, they were greedy too, the politicians. And the Democrats tended to be the ones who ran political machines. That is, they had their party organization, their payoffs, their ugly organizations in big cities like New York City and Chicago, controlled by the Democrats. The big cities were mostly controlled by the Democrats. So to say that the Democratic Party was heroic is a huge exaggeration. But what the Democratic Party stood for still arouses some people. I'm perhaps foolish enough to be that way too. And the Republicans made their reputation as somewhat, how shall we say, the party of big money, big banks and big money. Not very pretty, but the Democrats weren't very pretty either, of course. Now, returning to a historical perspective of dates, the president who dominated that post-war Reconstruction period was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was the head general of the Northern Army. Grant was the victorious general in the Civil War. Grant was the man who met Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, we mentioned last time, at that little courthouse in Virginia, where Lee surrendered to Grant. Grant was the victor, Lee the defeated, but Grant was a great man at Appomattox. Grant was a great general, or at least the best the North had. And as a war hero then, he was elected president. First in 1868, 2 terms, 8 years, 4-4. Not nice. Scandals, corruption, payoffs, just a decadent time. So I remind you, the Reconstruction period was not pretty. But what followed the Reconstruction was not very pretty either. The South started to recover, as always, relying on agriculture, cotton again still. Blacks made very little progress in the South because what happened was the blacks had to find jobs. They went back to work picking cotton on the farms. They were paid very little, of course, and very quickly they were in debt to the large farmers and the local businesses. And it was almost slavery again. They were owned. They were owned. But at least they were free enough, in some cases, to escape to northern cities, especially Chicago, where not a very pretty life awaited them there either, because northerners didn't treat them very much better than southerners had treated them. And so the exodus of black people from the South to the northern cities occurred especially during this time, after the Civil War, the second half of the 19th century. Okay. Again, wars, we didn't have any wars during the second half of the 19th century that I recall. The first war came at the end of the century, the Spanish-American War. Did we have any wars then? No. Remarkable. Indian Wars. Indian Wars, yes. Ugly. Ugly. Impossible to see anything good in that terrible time. Basically, we took the lands from the Indians step by step. The Indians, who can admire what we did? I think it was inevitable. It was inevitable. The immigrants spread across the land. They wanted land. They needed more and more land. More and more whites went to the west. The Indians at first tried to get along with the whites. The whites tried to get along with the Indians too. But the clashes were inevitable and ugly, and also it was absolutely inevitable that the Indians would lose. How could the Indians beat the American army? Ugly and depressing. It's very difficult to see anything very uplifting and admirable unless one admires just energy and vitality and basically social Darwinism. After all, this was the age of Darwin in a sense too. Charles Darwin in England had published his Origin of Species in 1859, second half of the 19th century, and many people, intellectuals at least, claimed to agree with social Darwinism, as it was called, meaning the survival of the fittest. The powerful dominated the weak. The strong dominated the weak. That was the way of nature. That was the way of man too. It just seemed inevitable. So, I'm painting a picture in the second half of the 19th century of the gradual emergence of a labor movement, the gradual improvement, slow though, of the masses, let's say. Some nice things, what shall we say? Take a man like Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was probably a billionaire. Ford and Rockefeller did the same thing. These people, late in life, became philanthropists. A philanthropist is a lover of humanity, if you will. People who gave millions to various causes. Carnegie gave millions to building libraries. Good thing. Ford and Rockefeller gave millions for other good causes. So yes, one can say that some good came out of all these things, but huge fortunes were made, and mostly the poor made very slow progress, and some, like the blacks and the Indians, it's hard to see any progress at all. Some black heroes like Booker T. Washington started even some black colleges. I'm emphasizing race here, but I think you're interested in race. Anyway, no wars except the Indian Wars. Finally, we reach the end of the 19th century. The Spanish-American War, well, what was happening during this period? Other things. In the 1840s already, before the Civil War, President Monroe, a little earlier actually, had declared the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a very bold statement made by our president, James Monroe, who announced to the European powers, because the Europeans, of course, were trying to take as much as they could in South America, Spain and Portugal. The French were left out, the Germans were left out pretty much, but they tried to get in French Guiana, South America. The French had a kind of foothold. But the Americans announced that North and South America was our territory. That is, Europeans keep out. That doesn't mean that we were taking over, rather that we didn't want the Europeans there grabbing land and enslaving the people, we said. We didn't enslave the people either. Maybe it was a good thing, I don't know. Meanwhile, South American countries were gradually winning some independence, not pretty. We helped them a little bit, and then we did not take anything from them, so maybe we can admire that a little bit. South America and Central America these countries developed never a pretty thing, even uglier than our second half of the 19th century. it's not a pretty time. It's really hard to find very many good things happening during that time. Here and there, a few things, but gloomy. Anyway, we Americans were busy taking lands, of course, as I said, or getting them as cheaply as possible. During this time, we claimed the Philippines, for example. The Spanish were there already. So in 1898, we went to war with Spain, basically over the Philippines and Cuba. We wanted Spain out of Cuba. Why? Just because we wanted them out. Any good reason? No. We wanted them out of the Philippines. Why? I think because we wanted a base for our ships there. Any better reason? No. So basically, that was a cruel war against Spain. But the end result was that Spain was out of Cuba and out of the Philippines too. We did not take over Cuba at all. We let the Cuban people do that, as we did generally in Central and South America. So I like to think that we weren't as bad as some of the Europeans were, but they might disagree. I don't know. In any case, during this time we developed a large navy. Our army was could expand very quickly. We were explorers of the world. As you know, in 1853, that was even before the Civil War, we landed in Japan and pretty much forced the Japanese to accept our business. We landed also in Korea, as you know. The Europeans were busier than we were in China, the British especially. That was ugly. The Opium War and the Boxer Rebellion, when we sailed right in there to establish order. Not nice. This was kind of the age of what should we call it? Imperial expansion by the Europeans everywhere in the world. Africa, of course. This had been going on already earlier, though. After all, modern times. Let's say from about 1500, from the Renaissance to 1918, First World War. After all, in the world, what is this? This is the age of Western, meaning European, and then American expansion, colonialization, imperialism, some good things, many bad things. It's just Western domination of the world. Then we get the turn of the century. We enter the 20th century. What's happening? Well, the first major event of the 20th century that you must know about, and Asians tend not to because Asia was not involved in it really, not much, was the First World War. It's best to see the First World War as the inevitable clash of the colonial countries against each other on a huge scale. This had been happening before, of course. The French-Indian War in America was a form of the 7-Year War. You remember that from before, 1756, 1763. These clashing expansionist, imperialist countries had fought wars again and again for many years. What was so different about World War I, as we call it, World War I? The difference, there were several differences. One was the Germans. You have to understand, I'm getting off of American history now, but you have to understand this in order to understand World War I and World War II, which were so important in American history. Germany was not a country until 1871. In fact, neither was Italy. Neither of these was a country. There was a German language, a German culture, but a scattered Germany. Germany united under Prussia. The Prussians were militarily strong in northern Germany, Berlin. And finally, they united Germany. The Austrians were left out, well, that's another issue. And this Germany that came late to national unity entered the colonial race, the race for colonies, the race for empires, very late. But they became very rich and militarily very powerful, and they became aggressive. So quickly after the formation of Germany, then the Europeans started to form alliances for protection. Well, they had done this for all of history. Especially the French and the English, who were afraid of German expansion, formed an alliance because they feared German expansion. The Germans allied with Austria, who they didn't love each other, of course. The Italians, always kind of on the margin of things, in a sense were lucky in World War I, unlucky in World War II. In World War I, they allied a little late with England and France, so that they were among the winners. They too, though, entered the expansionist colonial race late. As I said, 1871, only in 1871 was there really an Italy. And so they tried to grab Libya and Ethiopia in northern Africa. Not pretty. This colonialism was never pretty, even at its best. So, in any case, by 1914, all the European countries, and that means some very small ones too, were united, and that includes Turkey too, by the way, were allied to other countries. And basically, these fell into two groups. Well, there was bound to be an explosion. The explosion took place in 1914 in a very strange way. The Archduke Ferdinand, Duke, high aristocrat figure, Archduke, very high aristocrat, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was paying a visit to Sarajevo in Bosnia, famous in the 1990s for war, down in Yugoslavia now. He went to Sarajevo and he was assassinated by a fanatic. This assassination meant the declaration of war of Bosnia against Bosnia by Austria. Austria declared war, but Bosnia was allied somehow with England and France. So suddenly everybody got involved in this war. There was no way out of it. They had these alliances and these treaties. War, the whole continent was at war. Incredible the way that happened. Now, what did America do? America in 1914, struggling, the economy sometimes up, sometimes down, the stock market sometimes up, sometimes down, getting rich, but problems too, because expansion was so fast. A feverish time of expansion still, on into the 20th century, and in a sense, perhaps it only stopped during the Depression. Huge expansion, and we certainly were not ready for war. We had a navy, that's true, but we had no standing army, really, and most Americans wanted to stay out of those crazy Europeans' war. And it seemed like they were crazy. And it still seems like they were crazy. But it's easy to see how this happened. In fact, it was inevitable. There was an inevitability about it that let's hope we can learn from, but I'm not optimistic about that. All these alliances, all these people with their fingers on the trigger, in a sense they wanted the war. But the American attitude was isolationist. we wanted to remain isolated from their crazy war. We would help the British a little bit because, after all, we speak the same language and we share some history. True, we had to kill a lot of them to win our independence. True, we had our little war in 1812. But generally, the people in the world to whom Americans have felt closest have been the Brits, language especially. The French, too, they helped us in our war, after all, and we never really fought them except that little French-Indian War. Our links were with the British and the French, much less with the Germans. We had never had much to do with the Germans. So, sympathy was with the British and French, and this sympathy tended to find expression more and more. Now, when a big war is going on, some people will profit by remaining out of the war. But some industries, of course, profit by involvement in war. That's natural. So, and everyone agreed that it was messy, but perhaps we better build our army a little bit at least, just in case. Well, I think it was inevitable that we would enter the war and that we would enter it on the side of the British and the French. For one thing, we started to send them, the British especially, some aid in the form of goods, materials, cotton, metal, maybe even weapons. I don't know my history well enough to know that, but I wouldn't be surprised if I were an American metal factory producing weapons, and if I knew that the British needed weapons, I certainly would increase production and find a way to sell them some weapons. It's certainly bound to happen. In any case, in 1916, finally, I think in 1916 or 17, we entered the war in 1917, but I'm thinking in 1916, the Germans, a German submarine, yes, they had submarines then, U-boat, sank the Lusitania. I think I have my facts right here. A big ocean liner that was probably carrying some goods for the British, support for the British. We had done it before. No wonder the Germans were angry. So the Germans made a big step, and a terrible step for them, but they were just sick of our covert support for the British and French. They sank the Lusitania, and enough Americans were ready to say, war, war, war. So we entered the war in 1917. Now, I want to remind you, the war had begun in 1914. For 3 years, some terrible killing had gone on. In some ways, it was the most terrible war ever. Certainly the most terrible European war, and it's hard to find a more terrible war than what Europeans still call the Great War. The Great War was World War I. More bodies in World War II, but that was terrible, because it was trench warfare. The British and French on one side, the Germans and their allies on the other. And the war that was fought, especially on that French-Belgian-German border, also in northern Italy, in Tyrol, Austria, for month after month, if you've seen some movies about this, it's just incredible. Month after month, millions of men in these trenches, these deep holes, barbed wire separating the two armies, 1,000 meters maybe separating the trenches, bombardment, artillery shooting all the time, the machine guns ready, and every once in a while, every day or 2 or 3 maybe, charge at night. Thousands of men going across this barbed wire field, slowed down, of course, by the barbed wire. The first guys killed easily. The second guys killed easily. And usually retreat. Thousands of men, hundreds of men, dead bodies left in that muddy, terrible territory, until the other side tries the same thing. Just insanity, the most insane kind of war, and terrible. We had stayed out of it, and it's easy to see why. But it's also easy to see that we, sooner or later, were going to get involved. In any case, 1917, Americans start singing over there, over there, over there. The Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. Oh, yeah. We sent a million men over there, no experience. People who think about these things a little bit, and who should think about these things, statesmen. If I had been an American statesman in 1914 to 1916 and had watched that war, I would have been worried a little bit. We needed some military experience, and I think some people think this way. This is one reason why we got involved in Vietnam, I think. A military cannot just sit and do nothing for year after year. This is, of course, why some people worry so much, rightly so, about the North Koreans. They've got this vast army, and when do they practice fighting? When do they take shots at people? When do they learn anything, how to conduct a war, how to fight a war? To practice for 50 years. Fortunately, nothing has happened there on our border between North and South Korea. But I think, I don't know, it's hard for me to explain, but I think some military people certainly thought that it was time that we got involved in a war, frankly. We were this huge country, ready to, probably already the most powerful country in the world, maybe the British, but maybe we were. And we didn't have an army. We weren't ready to defend ourselves. We couldn't defend ourselves very well, except by our Navy. I'm not sure that this is true, but this might have had something to do with it. In any case, over we went, inexperienced, raw, untrained, with very little training. We lost thousands, but we were so fresh and so well equipped, well supplied. The Germans and the Turks were exhausted, and we entered the war in 1917. The war ended in 1918. Now, I realize we're talking more about European history than American history here, but what can we do here? Just so you understand, the World War I ended in 1918. The Germans were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles in France. Very humiliating terms. The British, but especially the French, hated them. The Germans had to pay a lot of money to the French, reparations they're called. Parts of Germany were occupied by French troops. A terrible treaty. Our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, who was one of our better presidents, didn't like the treaty, thought it was unfair, but we had to sign it too. It was a treaty that was guaranteeing a new war. That Treaty of Versailles, I think, guaranteed World War II. Just guarantee. It was almost like, we want to have another war. That was a disaster, that Treaty of Versailles, I think. Inevitable too, though. I mean, how could it have been different? What should the French have just said? We forgive everything or something? I don't know. Notice too that the Germans were not really bad guys in World War I. It was an imperialist war, a war that inevitably came about. It was not like World War II, where we had a pretty clear case of bad guys. But the bad guy Germans of World War II the badness of them was partly traceable back to the Treaty of Versailles. Partly. Anyway, so the war ended. Our boys came back home. Hooray, hooray, hooray. The cry for isolation again. Let's stay out of those crazy Europeans' wars in the future. Let's just make money and settle our country and get rich. Or let's try to make a better country than we have had. That's true too. Now we enter the 1920s. This is the age of the wild 20s, the roaring 20s as they're called. If you get a chance to read one of our few real classics in the novel, The Great Gatsby, read it. It tells a lot. It was a time of great wealth, great expansion, the stock market just soaring. It was also a time of insanity in the sense of maybe there's something we ought to insert here. That moralistic American attitude, changing now a little bit, but I still think it's Americans tend to judge other people morally, tend to assume this moral righteousness stance as part of our aggressive Christianity, one of our uglier features maybe in some ways, one of our better features in other ways too, I don't know. But the moral superiority that we often assume is embarrassing. We have no claim of moral superiority. It's absurd. Anyway, the 20s, what made me think of this was, of course, during the 20s we had our prohibition. That is, no alcohol. Of course, illegal alcohol was produced, vast quantities, and this meant an underworld, a mafia, the underworld crime element involved. The Great Gatsby is about all this kind of thing. Huge fortunes, huge waste. Moral decadence. It was a time of moral decadence. But it was a huge reaction after World War I. Understandable. Certainly understandable. Also, we had, after a great struggle, we had managed to give women the vote. The Brits and the French had, I think, did it sooner than we did. Frankly, they did most things, good things, sooner than we did. They got rid of slavery long before we did, but then they didn't have so many slaves, and they didn't have a South like we had a South. Anyway, they gave women the vote, women's suffrage. Exciting, exciting. Prohibition against drinking, absurd. But American moralizing, the conservative Christian right, so vocal and so moral, produces some good things, but a lot of absurdity too, I think. Anyway, the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties came to a huge halt in 1929, October, I think, on Black Monday, Black Thursday, Black Friday, I don't remember what day it was. October something in 1929. The stock market crashed, panic. People became afraid and rushed to the banks, tried to take their money out of the banks. The banks never have the money that we give them because banks invest the money so that the money can make money. And of course, so a panic, which meant sell my stocks. I want to sell my stocks. I fear that they're not worth anything. And I want to go to the bank and take out all the money I have in the bank. Well, this was a guaranteed disaster. Some thousands of people committed suicide. That's a sign of how feverish the 1920s were, really. An overreaction like that, an extreme reaction like that, inappropriate, unreasonable, insane a little bit, but it happened. This created, not right away, but created the Depression. The 1930s was the decade, 10 years, of Depression. not very pretty, but I don't know. Huge poverty, joblessness, unemployment, millions of people unemployed, hard times. Hard times over the whole industrialized world. It wasn't just America, of course. The 1920s were a difficult time for the Western world. Not felt much probably in the Eastern world, but terrible in the Western world. It was during the 1920s that, of course, a Nazi movement and a fascist movement in Italy could develop, because it must have seemed, getting back to what I was saying before, it must have seemed to be the end of capitalism, the end of bourgeois democracy. Capitalism seemed to have failed. Bourgeois middle-class democracy seemed to be a bankrupt idea. And so people looked for other things. And the world was divided into right and left. It wasn't a good time to be a moderate. Right and left. To the right went the people who didn't believe in democracy at all and wanted the strong man, the iron fist. That was the way to get things done. Democracy is messy. Look at our election. But look at democracy. Democracy is messy, not tidy, not neat. We need a strong man in charge, a Mussolini, early in Italy, 1922 already. In Germany, 1933, Hitler and the Nazis took power. But many people in England and France and even in the USA sympathized with this right fascist, basically, movement. To the other extreme, we have the emergence of extreme socialist and communist ideas. Now, socialism and communism, socialism anyway, was as old as Marx, even older, really. The ideas began around 1820 and are traceable even back to the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, 1700s. Not so new, but Marx was the hero of it because he was a true economist, a thinker of on a high plane of economics. These were the people, the idealists mostly, who wanted a socialistic society in which the extremes of wealth and poverty were eliminated. Fair distribution of wealth. Nice idea, but these were the two extremes, right and left. And the same extremes were found in the USA too. So democracy was challenged in the USA too, but mostly democracy was strong. After all, we had had 150 years of it, and it worked, sort of, as democracy always sort of works. But it still works better than anything else, and I think everyone agrees with that. Everyone, even the North Koreans probably. Anyway, the 30s, a terrible time. Our president through the 30s was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. I haven't mentioned many presidents along here, like Teddy Roosevelt earlier, but the differences among them for me are not very significant now. FDR, a giant, whatever anyone thinks a giant, elected 4 times because of the crises of the first the Depression and then the war, Second World War now. FDR, as we call him, with his New Deal, the aim of which was to put the millions of unemployed men and women to work, not pay them much money, but public works, dams and roads and other things. Good idea, it worked. But it created a huge government too, a huge unwieldy, cumbersome, centralized government of millions of employees. And, I'm sorry. The result, really the main result of the New Deal, FDR's program, which most Americans agreed with, the opposition didn't have any better ideas, certainly. The result was the creation of this huge federal government. But most people agree that although FDR created it, even if the Republicans had been in power, they would have done the same thing. And of course, the Republicans always talk about reducing the government, giving more power to, I don't know, business or laissez-faire economics. We'll discuss that sometime. Anyway, that was the result. We weren't out of the impression, though, of the depression by the end of the 1930s. World War II began in Europe in 1939. Hitler's invasion of Poland was intolerable. Once again, the British and the French were allied. The Germans, this time, were allied with Italy and Japan, of course. Now we had a true world war. We know that the Japanese had started their expansion much earlier, 1905 even, in the Russo-Japanese War and their occupation of Korea and all that, we know. Their invasion of Manchuria in 1933. The world was, the camps were arming, ready for war. The Japanese certainly sought a war, and the Germans too. The Germans provoked World War II officially in 1939. Once again, we tried to stay out of it. Crazy Europeans, but once again, it was impossible. The U.S. entered the war, of course, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our naval base, our naval headquarters in Hawaii. Sank a lot of ships, killed a lot of people, and suddenly we were in the war. Some people believe that FDR knew, or at least some of his people knew, that the Japanese were going to attack, and let it happen because we had to get in the war. And I'm not so sure that's bad. I would accept that. I don't think that was a bad decision. It's true it cost us some people, and that's terrible. But if Germany and the Japanese had been allowed to continue the way they were going, the world would have been impossible, untenable. We would have found ourselves in an untenable position in the world. Dangerous world. In any case, we entered the war. Once again, we were not ready. We had a navy, but that was largely the Pacific Navy was in very bad shape, and as a result of Pearl Harbor. Thankfully, we had our aircraft carriers not at Pearl Harbor at the time, so we lost a lot of destroyers and battleships and planes, but we didn't lose the aircraft carriers, those cities on water. That would have been really bad. But gradually we built up the Navy in the Pacific and opposed the Japanese as we could. The Army, the Navy and the Marines were in the Pacific, gradually building up strength. The Army went to Europe. We started fighting in North Africa. The Russians got involved, and you must be aware of the role of the Russians in World War II. If the Russians had not done what they had done, the war would have lasted a much longer time. In any case, finally, the Nazis were defeated. Terrible cost. The whole world, terrible cost. Many dead. All over the world. This truly horrible war with its cruelties and atrocities that people still remember and should remember. What you may not know, you kids, VE Day, that is Victory in Europe as we call it, came in about April 1945. This meant that those millions of soldiers, some of our soldiers, would be shifted from Europe to the Pacific. Many of them thought that they were going to their deaths. They thought, and this was their attitude, they had escaped the Germans, but they feared coming to fight the Japanese. And the war in the Pacific was a terrible thing. But what they really feared was an invasion of Japan. Everyone realized that if we were to invade Japan, this would require at least 2 million soldiers. That the coast of Japan would be defended by men, women, and children, dug into little caves and holes, and fighting to the death. Probably 5 million of them would be killed. These were the estimates. Meanwhile, we had developed the atomic bomb, had tested it a little bit in the Bikini Islands in the Pacific, in New Mexico, of course, too. And this terrible moral decision that had to be made by President Truman, because in 1945 FDR had died, his vice president, Harry Truman, had taken over as president, certainly one of our best. We were really lucky. I think we've been lucky in the 20th century, frankly, most of the time. But Truman made the decision, and I certainly agree with it. We had no choice. Either we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima first, if the Japanese persisted, then Nagasaki. If they persisted still, then who knows where. But we had to do this, and in the end, it saved Japanese lives too. In fact, millions. If 120,000, let's say, died at Hiroshima, if 75,000 died, just to use these numbers, these terrible numbers, but compare that to the 2 million and 5 million if we had invaded Japan. Okay, not everyone is convinced by numbers. I think most people are, but not everyone is. If one is not convinced by numbers, I think most people are. In any case, I find the dropping of the bombs, a moral necessity, or a military necessity, a moral terrible thing, morally a terrible thing, but in the end inevitable, unavoidable. Even as it is, elements of the Japanese did not want to surrender. The conservatives, the extreme nationalists, did not want to surrender, but finally, on August 15th, as you know, the Japanese surrendered. Now, I haven't left myself any time to discuss anything after World War II. I guess we better start. Just to draw some conclusions here. We have discussed American history from the Civil War to the end of World War II, from 1865 to 1945. 80 years. Where did America stand at the end of World War II? Where did the world stand? Europe was ruins. Japan was almost ruined. No wonder we had to be involved in the recovery of these countries. We had to be involved in the recovery of these countries, and that meant that we stayed in Europe and we stayed in Japan. A different world emerged. Thank you.